In this lesson, we take a look at the shadow matte shader. So from the create menu, shader, add an Arnold shader network, and let's search for the shadow matte. Under surface, we have our shadow matte shader. And let me also rename this to shadow matte. Shadow matte is a very useful shader to integrate your 3D geometries onto HDR environments or photographic backplate. So you basically apply this shader to the floor plane to catch shadows from lighting within the scene. Now, in this scene, as you can see, I have only this kind of floor plane geometry and also this car model that you can find it in your Cinema 4D scanner browser if you just search for car. This is the model here. And now let's start with the kind of lighting the scene and working with the shadow matte shader. Obviously, the first thing I want to do is to add an HDR environment. So from the Arnold menu, let's add an Arnold sky, change the color value to texture, and in the text folder for this section, you have this photographic backplate and this HDR image, and you can find these two maps at hdrmaps.com. They have tons of free and useful HDRI maps. So let's, in this case, load this HDRI, and let's also run the IPR. So this is the lighting that we are getting from this HDRI map. I'm gonna just select my Arnold sky and decrease the intensity to probably something like 0.75. That's better. Now I don't want to use these HDR maps as my background. I just wanted to use it as the source of the illumination. So I'm gonna go to my Arnold sky and zero out its camera contribution. Now we have its lighting, but we don't see it in the background. For the background, I'm gonna use that image photographic backplate that I showed you a moment before. So let's create a Cinema 4D background object. Now let's create an Arnold image from the texture menu. As you can see, just a simple shader network with an image connected to the Arnold Beauty. And here, let's load this photographic backplate here. Okay? And connect this image to the background. And if I hide this plane geometry here, you can see we have this photographic backplate. Now the next step would be to make sure that your camera matches the photographic backplate. Right now you can just go ahead and move around and pan around and make sure the view is exactly what you want. In this case, I've already done that, so let me undo the view for now. Now the next step would be to make sure that the HDRI that we have in the Arnold sky basically matching the backplate that we have. So what we can do is to simply hide this background. You can see the backplate here, so I can simply hide the background, and for the time being, let's increase the camera contribution to 1 again. And if I start rotating my HDRI, you can see now we have a very close match. You can see the backplate that we have was taken from this view. So now we have our HDRI map and our background at the same view. So we can select our Arnold sky, zero out the camera contribution again, and turn on the background. Also, let me unhide the plane that we have. The next step would be to actually assign the shadow matte shader to the plane or to the floor that we have to catch the shadows from the environment. So we have already created this shadow matte shader, right? Let's actually assign it to the plane object here. Immediately now, as you can see, we have integrated this car model to the environment using the shadow matte shader, and now we can see the shadows of our main geometry on the plane using the shadow matte shader. Now there are a few parameters in the shadow matte shader that are very important, so let's take a look at them. The first one is probably the shadow color, which controls the color of the shadows, and you can use it to tint the color of the shadows to match the photographic backplate. So In this case, we can use any color that you want, and you can see that here you can obviously decrease the shadow opacity if you want to. Then we have the background type, which is very important, and you can set the value according to the scene background to see the ground plane reflected properly in the indirect passes, for example, specular of the object. And we have two modes here. We have sky and image plane. Image plane uses a background object with a texture, and sky uses an Arnold sky. In this case, we actually used an image plane on the background. So we need to actually change the background type to, if I just change this to image plane, we're gonna have more accurate render. Okay, so if it was like this, so if I just hide this background for time being and again increase the camera contribution to 1 for my Arnold sky, now we have a very similar thing. Obviously we have the shadow matte shader, we have the plane catching the shadows from the environment and from our object. And in this case, when we don't use a background and only using an HDRI as our environment and as our backplate, we can simply use the sky background type. But for our case, where we use an actual image plane, I think I need to increase the samples of my Arnold sky again. Now, as I mentioned, in this case, because we're using the background object and we have applied an image plane to the Cinema 4D's background, we need to make sure the background type is set to image plane. Important options: if I come down to the diffuse section, we can actually enable the indirect diffuse. Right now, as you can see, the object that we have doesn't affect the indirect diffuse lighting. And if I just create a snapshot here, so this is basically without indirect diffuse lighting, and if I enable my indirect diffuse and increase the diffuse intensity to something like 3 so we can actually see it, or let's, to just make it more visible, set the diffuse intensity to 5. So as you can see immediately now, this object actually affecting the indirect diffuse lighting. And if I create a snapshot and compare it to our previous render, you can see in this one we don't have any indirect diffuse lighting, and in this one you can clearly see the effect. We have enabled our indirect diffuse lighting, and now the geometry and the shader of that geometry is actually affecting the overall render. In this case, let me just probably use something like let's use something like 1 in this case. Then in the specular section, you can actually enable indirect specular. If I just turn on indirect specular, you can immediately see now the reflection, or the specular reflections of the geometry is visible on the shadow catcher or on the floor. So you can obviously change the specular color if you want something weird, or increase the specular intensity to make the reflections more visible, or control the specular roughness. Want to make it very rough or very sharp and shiny. So for example, if it was a wet road, you needed to enable the indirect specular reflections to actually make the reflections of your subject visible in the floor. In this case, it doesn't really matter, but let's set the specular intensity to 1 and specular roughness probably 2.2. Now we have some specific AOVs for our shadow matte shader, and if let's just stop this for the time being and go to the render setting, Arnold render and AOVs. So at the time being, these specific shadow matte AOVs needed to be basically added manually, and you cannot find them in this list. So what we can do is to simply copy this, even though we still haven't talked about the AOVs, but later on we can talk about them. So for now, let me just copy this name of these AOVs and add them as custom AOV. So simply click on the add custom AOV, paste, okay. We have this other one, which is our shadow difference. Add a custom AOV, paste it here. In a future release, you might find these shadow matte AOVs right in the inactive list, so you don't need to add them using the custom AOVs. Just for example, search for the shadow diffuse difference and you can find this in here, but right now we need to actually add them manually. So let me copy the shadow mask. I think actually shadow mask was here, but it doesn't matter. Let's just paste it here. Then we have the indirect diffuse for the shadow matte. Paste, okay, and we have indirect specular. Add custom AOV, paste, and okay. And if I run the IPR right now, so if I take a look at my AOVs, we have this shadow AOV, which is a direct light shadow AOV. We have this shadow difference, which is a difference AOV, which can be used to eliminate the shadow from the direct component in compositing. We have this shadow mask, and this AOV can be used in composition to localize and tweak the shadows. We have our indirect diffuse shadow matte, and this creates a separate AOV render pass for indirect diffuse only. And we have our indirect specular, which creates a separate AOV render pass for indirect speculars only. So we have this specific shadow matte AOVs. Okay, we definitely talk about AOVs in depth in the rendering section of this course, and for now you only need to know that these AOVs or arbitrary output variables are available for the shadow matte shader to be used in compositing. So let me just get back to the beauty render and select the shadow matte shader. I don't want any indirect speculars in this case. And one thing that you can probably add, and I'll let you guys do it on your own, as you can see we have these very sharp shadows in this scene, and you can add distant light and try to match the direction of the shadows that you see in this scene, like here, and this will kind of add a bit more realism to your render, but I think this would be enough for this lesson. Okay, so that's about shadow matte shader in Arnold for Cinema 4D. See you in the next lesson to talk about another shading topic.